Hello bedtime explorer, tonight we slip quietly into the incense-thick mist of medieval Kyoto, where temple bells echo faintly in the distance and the air smells like cypress, lacquer, and damp stone. You stand in the twilight courtyard of a palace where everything glows gold and crimson in candlelight, and silence feels heavy, expectant, like history is holding its breath. There's no battlefield here. No katana drawn. Just soft silk robes, muffled sandals, and a boy whose name few outside Japan even remember, yet whose decisions, or lack thereof, echo centuries forward. His name is Go-Saga. You probably won't survive this reign, not from danger, but from terminal tedium. It's not that nothing happens. It's just that everything happens very quietly. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and local time. I love seeing where and when you're listening. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, close your eyes, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're about 11 years old, standing in a stiff court robe that weighs more than your uncle's horse, trying not to faint in front of a line of bearded men who somehow make bureaucracy look sacred. They are courtiers, scholars, monks, and more than a few spies. Welcome to the Japanese imperial court of the early 13th century, where power is both everywhere and nowhere. Go-Saga isn't emperor yet, not quite. He's still Prince Kunihito, born in 1220 to a once powerful emperor who abdicated before his diapers dried. Your dad, Emperor Tsukimikado, didn't get to rule for long. He got politely shoved aside in a dynastic spat and replaced by your cousin, who was more politically convenient. That cousin? Emperor Go-Horikawa, a puppet on a very visible string held by the Kamakura shogunate. Yes, we'll be seeing a lot of them. Imagine a ruling class made entirely of stoic men who solve disputes with swords and haiku. You, though? You just want to get through this etiquette exam without tripping on your sleeves. You grow up under the long shadows of others, retired emperors, regents, military clans, and monk scholars who speak in riddles. Your lessons aren't exactly kid-friendly, hours of waka poetry, Confucian classics, Buddhist scripture, and court dance. Oh, and you're also learning which smile to use when you're being diplomatically insulted. It's a whole syllabus. As Kyoto's seasons pass, you begin to realize that the real emperors are usually former emperors. Japan's unique Insei system, where the emperor retires but keeps ruling from behind the curtain, makes the whole throne feel a bit like a revolving seat in a shadow play. You're constantly hearing about your grandfather Go-Toba, who abdicated but basically kept running the country until the Jokyu War blew everything sideways. And let's pause there. The Jokyu War, which happened just before your time, was a civil war between imperial loyalists and the Kamakura shogunate. Spoiler, the shogunate won. Hard. They banished your grandpa to an island and let the samurai call the real shots from then on. Historians still argue whether this was the end of the emperor's actual power or just the start of a really long nap. You learn early that everyone wears masks, literal and figurative. The nobles at court speak in a dreamy, metaphorical dialect where "the moon is pale tonight" might mean "I'm plotting your downfall." And yet, They do it with such grace that you almost feel bad being paranoid. Your father, now a monk in exile, writes you letters. Poetic, cryptic things that smell faintly of ink and regret. You don't get to see him much, but you know he still dreams of the throne, even if he won't say it outright. Everyone dreams of the throne, but no one seems to know what to do with it. You, meanwhile, wait. Always waiting. You study, bow, chant, perform rituals, and try to keep your eyes open during the Lotus Sutra recitations. Court life is a balancing act between visible grace and invisible dread. You start to understand that in this world, silence speaks louder than declarations, and restraint is a form of dominance. At 13, you are officially given a princely title, though it changes depending on which faction is speaking. Some call you a compromise. Others, an inconvenience. You are the son of a sidelined emperor, but you're quietly being positioned as a backup plan, a dynastic spare tire in case the ruling line gets a flat. And then, rumors begin. Whispers echo through cedar-paneled corridors that the current emperor, Go-Horikawa's son Shige, is not long for this world. He's sickly, delicate, and possibly cursed, depending on which priest you ask. You're told not to talk about it, but everyone is talking about it, in hushed tones behind embroidered screens. And yes, there are diviners involved. The Japanese court never did anything without consulting at least 3-star readers, a ghost whisperer, and someone who could interpret turtle shells. They read omens in fire cracks and ink spills. One even claims to see your face glowing in a lacquer bowl. Possibly an early case of court-sponsored hallucination, or branding genius. Still, the omens pile up. The court is uneasy, but not chaotic. That's the weird thing about this period, it feels like everything is on the verge of change, and yet no one moves. It's like watching a chess game where both players just sip tea for 50 years. Then, at 16, your life changes, not with a trumpet blast, but with a letter. Emperor Shige dies suddenly. It's either a tragic accident or a quiet removal, depending on how deeply you believe in whispers. Either way, the throne is open, and the shogunate doesn't want a strong contender. They want you. Unassuming. Tactful. Politely bland. Perfect. And just like that, you are no longer Prince Kunihito. You are Go-Saga, the 88th Emperor of Japan. Well, sort of. Because here's the kicker. Your coronation comes pre-packaged with a leash. The Kamakura shogunate agrees to support your ascension on the condition that you don't get ideas. You're a ceremonial figurehead. A pretty seal on the documents they're already signing. The real power still flows through Kamakura's Hojo clan, particularly the Shikan, the shogun's regent, who at this point might as well be the shogun himself. So you accept. You bow. You perform the sacred rites and recite the sacred words. And deep inside, as you sit on the chrysanthemum throne with incense curling around your ears, you realize the truth. You're now the symbol of an empire that doesn't really need you. But oh, you're going to make the most of it. You've mastered the art of existing quietly. And now, you begin the subtle game of reigning without shaking the teacup. The throne is warm, though not from your influence. It's been recently vacated, first by Go-Horikawa, then by his son Emperor Shige, and now you, Go-Saga, slide gently into place like a silk fan being tucked into a lacquered sleeve. No bloodshed. No rebellion. Just a quiet nod from Kamakura's regents and a flutter of court robes. You don't inherit a country so much as you inherit a script. You read the lines, poised, practiced, perfectly forgettable, and the actors around you keep the play going. Your job is to perform imperial dignity without attempting real imperial power. Congratulations, you're the world's most ceremonial teenager. Still, this elevation wasn't inevitable. Let's rewind a little, because the way you got here is about as straightforward as a kimono knot during a typhoon. Your father, former Emperor Tsukimikado, had abdicated years ago under pressure from both the cloistered Emperor Gotoba and the Kamakura shogunate. The imperial house, at this point, is not so much one tree as two competing branches twisted around each other. It's like being born into a family that never actually decides whose turn it is to hold the TV remote, except the remote is divine authority and centuries of national identity. Your uncle, Emperor Juntoku, was also in the mix before being exiled for participating in the failed Joki War. He probably thought he'd have more luck with swords than scrolls. Spoiler, he didn't. This left the shogunate with a headache. They needed someone with the right imperial pedigree but no real teeth. That's when your name started floating up from the back ranks of the family tree like a polite bubble. You were, politically speaking, a Goldilocks emperor. Not too radical. Not too compromised. Just right. When Shige dies in 1242, the succession question hangs over Kyoto like mist. The shogunate doesn't want to give the throne to a prince from Gotoba's exiled line. That'd be like giving a loaded match to a guy who already tried to burn down the house. But they also can't put just anyone on the throne. That's when you, the soft-spoken, ink-smudged prince who's offended no one and inspired nothing, become the ideal candidate. And here's where things get awkward. The imperial court, as it so often does, complicates everything with layers of ceremony, astrology, and etiquette so dense they could be weaponized. Technically, you can't be enthroned unless the succession is clear. But Shige left no heirs, and the existing lines are tangled with grudges, curses, and, let's call it, exile-adjacent complications. So the throne skips a beat. There's a temporary interregnum, a brief pause in the great imperial playlist, while everyone argues over who should wear the crown. The shogunate even floats another name first, Prince Tadanari, a different cousin from the Saionji family. But political winds shift, and suddenly the puppet masters in Kamakura find you preferable. You, with your composed silence and studied obedience. So they call you up. And you bow. And you nod. And you pretend that this wasn't all you'd ever hoped for, feared, and prepared to endure. At age 22, you're crowned emperor. Let's be honest, that's already a late start for an emperor by Heian and Kamakura standards. Many took the throne as toddlers, sometimes younger. You've already watched friends get married, sent letters from exiled relatives, memorized more waka poetry than is probably healthy, and somehow lived in a palace that smells perpetually of pine resin and bureaucratic despair. Still, the moment is momentous, even if no one quite knows what to do with it. The enthronement ceremony is dazzling. You wear multiple layers of robes, some of which are so heavy they could double as makeshift bunkers. Court musicians pluck and drum around you with hypnotic rhythm, and priests chant in tones so slow they seem to echo through time itself. You're handed the sacred regalia, or at least symbolic versions of them, because the real ones might have been lost during earlier conflicts. Or stolen. Or sunken. Historians still argue whether the mirror you receive is the original, or a really old knockoff. You sit. You listen. You breathe incense and history in equal measure. And you try not to shift awkwardly on a cushion that has not been replaced since the 1100s. From the outside, the throne appears majestic, divine even. But inside, it feels like a carefully locked cage. You have attendants for everything, people to fold your sleeves, refill your inkstone, and remove the petals from your tea. But you can't actually make a decision without 10 layers of approval, a council meeting, a blessing, and at least one poetry contest. Power, you're discovering, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it hides inside who gets to suggest the suggestion. Meanwhile, the shogunate back in Kamakura pretends to defer to your wisdom while quietly vetoing any idea you float that doesn't align with their plans. Think of them like a modern middle manager who says, "Great initiative," before deleting your email. Still, you're not completely powerless. You do get to influence ceremonial appointments, manage imperial lands, what's left of them, and more importantly, orchestrate marriages. And this, dear listener, is where your reign starts to sparkle, just a little. Because what you lack in military or political muscle, you make up for in family planning. You begin sowing dynastic seeds with precision. Marriages are arranged not for love, but for lineage, complex webs meant to secure imperial succession and reinforce your descendants' legitimacy. One fringe tale even claims you consulted astrologers so obsessively about matchmaking that one monk started charging you double. Probably fiction, but it speaks to your reputation, methodical, quiet, calculating. Like someone playing Go with invisible stones. There's also a certain irony here. Your reign is called uneventful by most scholars, and sure, no wars, no coups, no major reforms. But in your quiet choices, you're planting mines beneath the future. You don't just inherit the crown, you position it like a trapdoor. Because guess what? Those two imperial lines you start juggling, your sons from different consorts, will one day split into rival factions. Centuries of civil strife? Yeah, that's you. Well done. But for now, no one sees that coming. All they see is a mild-mannered emperor gliding through ceremonies, reciting poetry about ducks in snow, and pretending not to notice that the military government just rejected your budget proposal. Again. So the throne passes sideways. Not in drama or fire, but in carefully managed silence. And you? You just keep smiling. Your palace breathes like an old temple, full of layers, hidden corridors, whispered footsteps. As the seasons turn, you, Emperor Go-Saga, become not just a monarch of robes and rituals, but a quiet strategist of dynasties. The throne may not command armies anymore, but it still commands legitimacy. And legitimacy? That's the crown jewel everyone wants, especially in an age where samurai swing the swords, but emperors bless the swing. You spend your days surrounded by scrolls, candles, and bureaucrats who specialize in smiling without saying yes. You sign proclamations written by other people's hands and perform seasonal rituals with perfect poise. The rice planting ceremony, the imperial harvest, the sacred offerings to Amaterasu. You're like a walking postcard from a time when emperors meant something. But while your outer world is all incense and chrysanthemum motifs, your inner world is starting to buzz. You've begun to see the real leverage in the one place left untouched by the shogunate, succession. And you know exactly how to wield it. You start with your own bloodline. Not content with just being emperor, you begin laying the groundwork for a legacy, a dynasty within the dynasty. You father children like you're planning a family board game with too many players. The most important? 2 sons from 2 different women, Prince Hisahito and Prince Munetaka. Each with their own future, their own mother, and soon, their own claim to the throne. Now here's the tricky part. You understand that Kamakura won't let you rule indefinitely. You're a placeholder emperor. A ceremonial stamp. So, you lean into it. After just a few years on the throne, 10, to be exact, you do something very strategic. You retire. Yes. Step off the throne at 32. Bow out. Smile. Let the nation believe it was always part of the plan. And in your place, you install your eldest son, Prince Hisahito, who becomes Emperor Go-Saga. He's only 4 years old. 4. Which means he's about as useful in council meetings as a decorative pillow, and just as quiet. And you? You become what's known as a cloistered emperor. It's like early retirement, but with way more influence. In Japan's unique political structure, retired emperors often pulled more strings from behind the screen than they ever did from the throne. Think of it as ruling while wearing slippers. You now control the flow of imperial authority, when, how, and to whom it's handed off. The shogunate doesn't love it, but they tolerate it. After all, you're not raising armies or stirring rebellion. You're just sitting in the back row of power, sipping tea, and outlasting everyone. Historians still argue whether your retirement was a noble gesture, a tactical retreat, or an extremely long-form checkmate. But one thing is clear, you're not done ruling. You've simply changed outfits. And here's the best part. While the Kamakura shogunate watches you retire with cautious approval, you begin engineering double succession. Because a few years into Go-Saga's reign, you pull another surprise. You have him step down, again, very politely, and replace him with your other son, Prince Munetaka. Boom. 2 emperors, 2 bloodlines, 2 claims. You've just split the imperial line down the middle like a daikon. Munetaka becomes emperor, but with a twist. He's been sent away, to Kamakura itself. Why? Because the shogunate wants to keep a closer eye on the imperial heir. It's like sending your future boss to summer camp, but the camp has swords, spies, and an entire military command. And while this seems like a loss, your son far from court, it's actually a brilliant move. You now have imperial presence in both Kyoto and Kamakura. 2 sons. 2 capitals. 2 places the Go-Saga bloodline now drips like slow ink. In the quiet margins, some nobles begin to wonder, is Go-Saga still playing the part of a ceremonial figurehead? Or is he quietly arranging the imperial chessboard in ways no one saw coming? Meanwhile, everyday life at court rolls on. Poetry contests become the new battleground. You sponsor temples. You host calligraphy exhibitions. Occasionally, you even weigh in on which flute-playing courtier is causing drama. It's all very dignified. And then there's the fringe stuff. One odd record tells of a dream interpreter who claimed you were the reincarnation of a Chinese emperor. Another court gossip suggests you banned peach blossoms from the inner garden for being too cheerful. Probably apocryphal, but honestly, it sounds on brand. And still, you watch. Over the next years, you keep Go-Fukakusa and Munetaka on a slow rotation, both now former emperors, future power brokers, and, more importantly, rivals. You've planted the seeds of 2 competing imperial lines, the Jimmian line, descended from Go-Fukakusa, and the Daikakuji line, from Munetaka. Their descendants will bicker, scheme, and fight over succession for centuries to come. You've essentially created a time bomb and buried it beneath a pillow made of silk and prayers. At court, no one notices. Or they pretend not to. Everyone's too busy composing verses about dew on chrysanthemums to point out that you've quietly created the conditions for future civil war. In your time, it's all serene. But future historians will trace the Nanboku-ch period, Japan's violent North-South court split, directly back to you. It's like pulling a thread that unravels a tapestry 2 generations later. And you? You just keep smiling behind your fan. In your quiet way, you've managed something remarkable. You've taken a reign with no wars, no coups, no grand reforms, and turned it into a fork in the road of Japanese history. Not with blood, but with lineage. And still, the ceremonies go on. You walk beneath maple trees that shade ancient stone paths. You sip bitter tea in a lacquered room that hasn't changed since the Genpei War. You nod sagely as ministers debate over calendar days and rice allocations, knowing that none of it matters as much as the simple truth. You've become more powerful after the throne than you ever were on it. There's a certain stillness to being emperor in retirement. The world hums along outside your lacquered screens, and yet you, Go-Saga, are the still point around which things quietly pivot. You stroll gardens dusted with pine needles, read poetry by candlelight, and receive endless scrolls of court documents with your name on them, though you rarely need to read more than the seals to know how they'll end. You've officially passed on the throne, not once, but twice. Your sons, Go-Fukakusa, and then Kameyama, not Munetaka, who'd been stationed at Kamakura, have worn the crown, albeit briefly. And still, you preside from behind the curtain, more influential in absence than you ever were in presence. This, Insei, the cloistered rule, has become your true reign. The Heian court may be gone in name, but its ghost lingers. You, in many ways, are its last whisper. You preside over an age where form has devoured substance. The robes are heavy. The rules are heavier. There are 87 steps to serve tea to an emperor, and the wrong incense combination can technically delay an imperial decree. Still, it's all to your taste. You drift through this choreography with the practiced grace of someone who knows how to turn silence into authority. You're not a warrior, but you understand timing. You're not a rebel, but you've upended imperial succession with the gentlest touch. And now, with your family line branching like a bonsai tree that's been deliberately pruned and twisted, you begin to pay closer attention to the real game, positioning your blood for the long run. You become obsessed, quietly, of course, with family trees. You attend more Omiai matchmaking ceremonies than any emperor in recent memory. You nod politely through hours of presentations about which daughter of which noble family might be best suited for which prince. Your staff starts joking that your next title will be His Majesty, Emperor of Marriages. But it's all strategy. You're placing your descendants in every pocket of court influence, weaving Go-Saga blood into the very DNA of future politics. One particularly brilliant move. You orchestrate a marriage between your son, Prince Moriyoshi, and the daughter of a powerful court noble aligned with the Fujiwara. That union doesn't just win you points at court, it plants another seed in the ever-growing imperial network. One that will matter deeply in decades to come, especially when future emperors start squabbling over legitimacy like toddlers fighting over mochi. Meanwhile, outside your quiet palace of scrolls and incense, the real Japan keeps grinding along. The shogunate in Kamakura is still the actual engine of governance, collecting taxes, appointing military governors, dealing with pirates. Yes, pirates. Not quite the Johnny Depp kind. More the raiding inland temples in full armor kind. You, being far removed from these affairs, are technically above it all. But that doesn't mean you're ignorant. You receive reports. You know that the regents, the HJ clan, are running things with increasing arrogance. You see them installing young emperors, forcing abdications, and using the court like a theme park attraction. Historians still argue whether you privately loathed them or simply learned to use them. But there's something faintly poetic about the way you let them think they're in control, while gently steering the imperial ship beneath the waves. Take, for instance, your subtle move to restore ceremonial authority. You reintroduce certain sacred rites long neglected under previous reigns, rituals invoking Amaterasu's favor, recitations that frame the emperor as the axis of heaven and earth. They don't do much politically, but symbolically, they're thunderclaps. You remind the court, and the shogunate, that while military power may dominate, only the emperor sanctifies. Only you can bless rice planting season. Only your bloodline speaks to the gods. Even the regents tread carefully around that. Then there are the eccentric touches. A fringe account, possibly invented by an overly poetic monk, claims that you once ordered a turtle with 5 moss patches on its back to be given an honorary title. Why? Because it reminded you of your own slow, steady reign. No one's quite sure if it happened, but you have to admit, a turtle emperor has a certain sleepy grandeur. More curious still, your supposed fondness for an unusual kind of court entertainment called Shikisen no Ien, a poetic game involving floating cups of sake down a garden stream while nobles frantically compose impromptu verses before their drink drifts out of reach. Harmless fun, unless someone gets too enthusiastic and ends up in the koi pond. Which apparently happened. Twice. But these rituals and games, the poetry contests, the incense blending tournaments, they're not distractions. They're your theater of power. Because what the shogunate forgets is this: perception is legacy. And you're masterfully crafting a reign that looks, on the surface, like a peaceful golden age. No wars. No rebellions. No upheaval. Just the gentle rhythm of court life and a wise, quiet emperor gliding through it all like a crane through morning mist. Even though, underneath it, you're repositioning the very foundations of the imperial house. And while the HJ regents continue to treat emperors like set pieces in a grand kabuki play, you keep whispering into the ears of monks, poets, princes, and lovers, reminding them that history isn't made by blades alone. Sometimes, it's made by scrolls, silk sleeves, and who gets to sit closest to the sun-dappled veranda. So you keep watching, and arranging, and slowly, patiently, ensuring that the Go-Saga line won't just survive, it will outlast them all. You don't get to watch what happens after your final breath. But if you could drift, spectre-like, across the tiles of the imperial court, or perch atop the peaked roofs of Kamakura, you'd probably raise one celestial eyebrow and mutter something like, "Well, this escalated quickly." Because after you, Go-Saga, slip into the incense-sweet folds of death, the carefully balanced dynasty you engineered begins to wobble. Not with a bang, but with a slow, ceremonial shuffle of feet in opposing directions. The split you created, Go-Fukakusa's line versus Kameyama's, is no longer just an academic family tree dispute. It becomes a real contest of imperial ambition. Your sons may have played nicely in your shadow, but your grandsons, not so much. Let's zoom in. On one side, the Jimmian line, descended from Go-Fukakusa, elder son, proper and precise, traditionally inclined. On the other, the Daikakuji line, descended from Kameyama, younger son, politically assertive, and just a touch scrappier. Each branch has its supporters. Each claims rightful succession. And with you no longer there to balance the scale, both sides start lobbying the real power center, the Kamakura shogunate. Now, you remember how the shogunate operates, right? It doesn't choose emperors based on philosophical merit or heavenly alignment. It chooses them based on convenience, on control, on how manageable the boy is and how amenable his regent uncle might be. So it plays the lines off each other like a bored noble playing Go with himself. First, it supports Go-Fukakusa's son, Emperor Fushimi, from the Jimmian branch. Then, a few years later, it switches allegiance to Kameyama's descendants, installing Emperor Go-Uda of the Daikakuji line. It's like musical thrones, but with more brocade and slightly less dancing. Historians still argue whether this alternating succession plan was intentional or simply a patch job response to dynastic chaos. But either way, it turns the imperial court into a mirror maze of titles, abdications, and passive-aggressive calligraphy. Meanwhile, the court gets tense. You wouldn't recognize parts of it now. The gentle, static choreography you once glided through has become a stage for veiled sniping. Courtiers openly question who should hold the regalia. Empress dowagers from rival lines give each other the silent treatment so hard it practically echoes. Even the ritual tea servers start whispering about which side is more divine. You'd think, given how poetic Kyoto likes to be, someone would write a tragic no-play about it. But no one has the time. Everyone's too busy recalculating their alliances. And still, amid all this polite panic, the shogunate rules with a detached sort of condescension. The HJ regents aren't trying to pick a winner. They're trying to prevent any one branch from getting too confident. By toggling between Jimmuan and Daikakuji emperors, they keep both sides unstable, both sides dependent. It's clever. It's petty. It's wildly unsustainable. You, had you been alive, might have appreciated the irony. You, who loved equilibrium and quiet power, now have a dynasty where balance is enforced by instability. It's a little like keeping a teacup from falling by spinning the table constantly. Looks impressive. Completely exhausting. But let's zoom out for a moment. Because while the imperial court spirals into elegant rivalry, the country's about to face something bigger. Remember those letters from Kublai Khan? The whole submit or else situation. Well, the or else just showed up. In 1274, just 2 years after your death, the Mongols arrive. Not a metaphorical arrival. Not a letter. A fleet. They launch from Korea in a storm of sails and fury. They bring advanced weapons, fearsome cavalry tactics, and what the samurai consider incredibly rude battlefield behavior. For example, the Mongols actually coordinate. They bang drums. They use signals. They don't wait for you to shout your name and charge honorably. So disrespectful. The invaders land at Hakata Bay on Kyushu. They strike fast, burning towns, looting, and confusing the local defenders with sheer ferocity. It's chaos. Screams. Steel. Smoke. And then, nature intervenes. A typhoon, violent, divine, almost suspiciously well-timed, slams into the fleet. Ships splinter. Soldiers drown. The survivors limp home, and the Japanese breathe again. The court, of course, interprets this as proof of divine protection. You can practically hear your old poetic advisors exclaiming from beyond the grave, "Behold! The gods defend the emperor's land." Cue ritual dancing. Cue thousands of hand-copied prayers. Cue scrolls with dramatic calligraphy reading kamikaze, divine wind. Yes, that word. This is the origin story. But here's the thing, the Mongols aren't done. In 1281, they come back, with more ships. More men. This time, the shogunate builds defensive walls along the shores of Kyushu. Archers line the battlements. Samurai sharpen their blades. They brace for the end. And again, another storm. Again, the fleet is devastated. Drowned. Wrecked. And again, Japan survives. Your court, still split, still bickering, unites just long enough to credit you. Or rather, your lineage. Clearly, the gods protect the land because your divine blood remains on the throne, even if it now comes in two flavors. But these wars have a cost. The shogunate, victorious though it may be, can't reward its samurai. There's no conquered land to distribute. No loot. Just debt. And resentment. That resentment festers. And while Kyoto remains draped in incense and rival genealogies, Kamakura begins to fracture. You've been gone for a decade now, but your influence pulses in every decision, every dispute, every quiet poem scribbled in the margin of a palace ledger. Your legacy isn't just one of lineage, it's one of design. You created a system with no off switch. And the funny thing? It worked exactly as intended. Right up until it didn't. The cherry blossoms fall with an indifference that stings a little more each year. They don't care which imperial grandson wears the crown today. They don't care whether it's the Jimian or the Daikakuji line occupying the chrysanthemum throne. The blossoms just drift downward, silken, cyclical, and entirely unimpressed by the fragile ambitions of men. You, Go-Saga, remain deeply entombed in imperial memory by now, your name whispered in both reverence and resentment. It's 1290. You've been gone for nearly 2 decades, and yet your blueprint still defines everything. The alternating emperor system? Still very much a thing. The palace intrigue? Oh, flourishing. But the real drama? That's starting to bubble just outside the lacquered gates. Because something has shifted in the wind, something subtle, but unsettling. The Kamakura shogunate, once a sturdy scaffold beneath the throne, now limps forward under the weight of its own contradictions. After the twin Mongol invasions, both barely thwarted by nature, the military regime finds itself facing a deeply inconvenient truth: it's broke. The reward system that once kept samurai loyal is in tatters. There was no victory loot from the Mongols, no conquered provinces to parcel out like slices of mochi. Just an ocean full of wrecked ships, soggy banners, and the haunting silence of debts unpaid. Samurai families begin grumbling. Loudly. They've lost sons for what? Wall building duty? A typhoon's mercy? And at the same time, in the capital, your descendants continue their high-stakes game of imperial musical chairs. By 1301, another branch change, the Daikakuji line returns to power with Emperor Go-Neji. His young, pious, and, unfortunately, utterly entangled in the ambitions of his grandfather, the retired Emperor Kameyama. You know the type. You were the type. A cloistered puppet master operating behind a silk curtain. Kameyama, your son, sees an opportunity. He wants to stabilize the Daikakuji claim. No more back and forth. No more alternating reigns. Just one strong, continuous line. A dynasty within the dynasty. And that ambition? It terrifies the shogunate. Because while the emperors may wear silk and speak in poetry, they hold symbolic power, power that could be weaponized if the court ever decides to pull the veil off and get political. The HJ regents in Kamakura have always preferred a weak emperor. A predictable, pliable emperor. But if Kameyama makes a play, if his grandson strengthens his hold, that's trouble. So the shogunate quietly begins to lean back toward the Jimmian line. The pendulum swings yet again. In 1308, after Go-Niji's death, they install Emperor Hanazono, descended from the Jimmian line. The game resets. Sort of. Because here's the thing no one admits at court parties anymore, the alternating succession is slowly becoming unworkable. Each side resents the arrangement. Each sees its own reigns as the true reigns and the other as unfortunate interruptions. Courtiers start referring to the other line's emperors with just the slightest acidic tinge, polite, but poisonous. Even the court poets get in on it. A waka shows up in a seasonal anthology that, on the surface, praises moonlight over the pines, but it's a thinly veiled metaphor for, my branch of the family is superior. Poetic trash talk, 14th century style. And here's your favorite part, scholars today still argue whether this whole era, with its layered power plays and behind-the-fan insults, counts as effective governance or an extended cosplay of legitimacy. One school sees it as elegant decay, another as survivalism through ceremony. The truth? Probably a bit of both. Meanwhile, Japan's real problems are growing teeth. Famine stalks the countryside. Harvests fail. Bandits become bolder. Peasant unrest simmers quietly, like miso left too long on the stove. And into this fragile ecosystem steps someone new. Someone who will, in time, toss the entire chessboard into the ocean. But we're not there yet. Not quite. In 1318, Emperor Go-Daigo takes the throne. He's from the Daikakuji line, and on the surface, he seems like any other poetic, ceremonial figurehead. But under the layers of court formality and genuflection, Go-Daigo is different. Ambitious. Restless. And, some might say, a bit reckless. He studies history. Your history. He reads about your long, indirect reign. He studies the cloistered maneuverings of your retirement palace and marvels at how you directed the future without ever raising a sword. And he thinks, I can do better. Except unlike you, he doesn't want to rule from behind a screen. He wants to actually rule. Directly. Dangerously. It starts slowly. He begins appointing loyalists to important court roles. He expands the imperial household's influence in regional matters. He even dreams of restoring the old imperial tax systems. And the shogunate? They notice. Of course they notice. It's like watching a house cat slowly sharpen its claws on your favorite heirloom. So what does the shogunate do? They panic. And they plot. But Go-Daigo isn't like previous emperors. He doesn't politely abdicate when asked. He digs in. Makes alliances. Sends secret messages to regional lords. Promises a restoration of imperial glory. It's revolutionary talk. Borderline treasonous. and absolutely, deliciously chaotic. You, Go-Saga, long dead, would probably smile, just a little. Because here it is, the ultimate legacy of your quiet dynasty-splitting decision. You created 2 imperial lines in an effort to preserve the throne. But one of them has now produced an emperor who wants it all back. The silence before the storm is gone now. The winds are picking up. Something is coming. And this time, the gods might not be enough. The scrolls you once held so delicately now tremble in the hands of scribes writing down decrees that don't make sense anymore. The rhythms of the court, so carefully measured, so impossibly restrained, begin to trip over themselves. And at the center of this controlled collapse, Go-Daigo, your great-grandson, cracking the porcelain mask of imperial passivity with a quiet but unmistakable roar. By now it's 1320-something. Nobody agrees exactly when things go from mildly spicy succession drama to full-blown imperial rebellion, but let's say the decade has energy. Go-Daigo, unlike most emperors of his age, and certainly unlike you, isn't content with being ceremonial wallpaper. He's been watching the Kamakura shogunate operate from afar, and he's had enough of their regency puppetry. What he wants is a real imperial revival, taxes under the throne's control, military governors answering directly to Kyoto, and, brace yourself, even the abolition of the shogunate. This is not a drill. He starts slowly. First, he stops playing the game of alternating succession. Refuses to name a successor from the Jimmian line. Bold. Then he starts gathering allies. Courtiers. Monks. Warriors in the provinces tired of Kamakura's shadowy, distant control. And then, when he feels the chessboard is set, he makes his move. In 1331, Go-Daigo openly declares war against the Kamakura shogunate. Let's pause here. This is not how emperors behave. Emperors write poetry. They supervise moon-viewing parties. They die quietly and leave poetic wills. They do not raise armies. But Go-Daigo? He's breaking the code. Not because he misunderstands it, but because he's done pretending it ever served him. He sees the emperorship not as a delicate ritual act, but as a divine right to rule, actively, forcefully. The shogunate, for their part, reacts the way any overextended, corrupt military regime might, with panic, confusion, and swift retaliation. They dispatch forces to Kyoto. They arrest Go-Daigo. They exile him to the Oki Islands, a familiar fate. That's where emperors go to sulk, vanish, or plot. Go-Daigo? He plots. Back on the mainland, something strange happens. Rebels don't disperse. They gather. Because Go-Daigo's boldness, his refusal to bow, to abdicate, sparks something. Across the provinces, especially in the west, samurai begin defecting from the shogunate. They don't necessarily care about imperial rituals, but they do care about being ignored, underpaid, and used like disposable armor. And then comes a name that changes everything, Ashikaga Takauji. Now, if your spirit still lingers in Kyoto, this is the moment you'd probably start pacing. Because Takauji is no ordinary noble. He's a member of a prestigious warrior family, descended from the Minamoto, and he's initially sent by the Kamakura shogunate to crush Go-Daigo's rebellion. Except, he doesn't. Instead, in 1333, Takauji turns on the shogunate, marches east, captures Kamakura, overthrows the HJ regents, like someone flipping a board game and declaring themselves the new game master. Go-Daigo, freed from exile, returns to Kyoto in triumph. It's dramatic. Triumphal arches, flower petals, flutes, the works. He establishes what will later be called the Kenmu Restoration, a brief, shimmering moment where the emperor rules directly, free of warrior regents and alternated succession. You'd think he'd be satisfied. Spoiler, he isn't. Because Go-Daigo, flushed with victory, makes a critical misstep. He starts distributing rewards not to his samurai backers, but to court nobles and old aristocratic families. He tries to turn back time, to reinstate Heian-era politics. He forgets that it wasn't priests and poets who put him back on the throne. It was men with swords. Men like Ashikaga Takauji. And those men? They're not impressed. In 1335, the inevitable happens. Takauji rebels against Go-Daigo, claiming that the emperor has lost his heavenly mandate. He marches on Kyoto. And when the imperial court flees, the cycle begins again. Takauji installs a rival emperor, Emperor KMY, from the Jimmuan line. That's right. We're back to double emperors. One in Kyoto under Takauji's protection. One in Yoshino, in the south, still loyal to Go-Daigo's dream of an independent, sacred throne. This sparks a new era, the Nanboku Ch period, literally, the southern and northern courts. It's your fault, you know. Well, partly. You're split between the Jimmuan and Daikakuji lines, which once felt like a clever way to placate power factions, is now a full-on dynastic war. Two emperors. Two courts. Two claimants to the same sacred regalia. For the next 6 decades, Japan will be ruled by a divided crown, a divided map, and a deeply divided memory of who gets to be called emperor. And amid the chaos, Ashikaga Takauji declares himself shogun. Establishes a new military government in Kyoto, the Ashikaga shogunate, also known as the Muromachi shogunate. So now we have a new shogunate. 2 imperial lines. A disgruntled nobility. Rebellious provinces. A court that's forgotten how to function unless it's fighting itself in verse. Oh, and let's not forget the economic downturn. And the Buddhist temple factions with armies of their own. And the peasant uprising sparked by a failed tax system. It's a historical smoothie, thick, chaotic, a little sour. You, had you lived to see it, might have dropped your fan in dismay. But somewhere, perhaps, a tiny part of you would be impressed. Because your long, quiet reign had ripple effect centuries deep. Your obsession with control gave rise to a war for the soul of Japan. And as the blossoms continue to fall, uncaring, unflinching, you realize the empire you preserved is now the empire they're fighting over. The rain hits the roof of the Yoshino palace like quiet applause, soft, insistent, oddly mournful. You stand at the edge of a veranda that overlooks pine-covered hills shrouded in fog. Not that you're actually there, of course, you're quite a few decades gone by now. But Go-Daigo is here, and the weight he carries is unmistakably yours. He's the first emperor in centuries to truly try and break the system you helped design. And now? He's holed up in the southern court, clutching the imperial regalia like a gambler holding the last chips at a folding table. Welcome to the Nanboku-ch period. That translates to southern and northern courts, but don't let the pleasant symmetry fool you. This isn't a polite disagreement over ceremonial rites. It's a dynastic tug-of-war with all the bitterness of a long-running family lawsuit. On one side sits Go-Daigo's southern court in Yoshino, righteous, stripped down, poetic. On the other, the Ashikaga-backed northern court in Kyoto, lavish, powerful, and increasingly popular among warlords. And somewhere in the middle, everyone else, trying to guess which emperor to honor without losing their rice fields, or their heads. Go-Daigo, bless him, doesn't give up. Even after being forced out of Kyoto by Takauji's forces, he insists he alone holds the legitimate regalia, the mirror, the sword, the jewel. He refuses to call his rivals emperors. In documents, they're just pretenders, or more cuttingly, those who sit the throne without the sun's blessing. Meanwhile, Takauji plays a subtler game. His northern court has the capital, the infrastructure, the high temples, and, most crucially, access to wealth. And though KMY, his chosen emperor, may not be spiritually legitimate, he's got the robes and the rituals. In the minds of many Japanese, that's enough. This duality confuses everyone, especially the poor farmers who don't know which calendar to follow or which court official will confiscate their barley this week. You can picture one peasant asking, "Wait, we're bowing to which emperor this season?" and the village elder replying, "The one whose tax collector has more horses." The rivalry lasts 60 years. Yes, you heard that right. 6-0. And during that time, Japan is a mosaic of factionalism, ambition, and perpetual swordplay. Local lords, called daimi, rise and fall with bewildering speed. Some pledge loyalty to the southern court out of piety or honor. Others back the northern court for the power and perks. And many switch sides as often as they change helmets. Temples become fortresses. Monks become generals. Even children are trained to wield naginata in case a new emperor's emissary comes knocking. It's a chaotic, tangled period of history where no one trusts anyone, and everyone's cousin knows a guy with a sword. And yet, through all this madness, Go-Daigo continues to rule from Yoshino, issuing decrees on paper that rarely leave the mountains. His court is sparse, more poetry circle than government. They write verse by candlelight, comparing their exile to plum blossoms blooming in snow. They frame their struggle as righteous suffering, as a divine test of imperial virtue. But the Ashikaga regime? It thrives. Takauji dies in 1358, but his successors keep the shogunate going. The Ashikaga shoguns aren't as strict as the Kamakura HJ were. They embrace art, culture, and architecture. They build temples, patronize no theater, and support the emerging Zen aesthetic, minimalist, serene, and somehow always damp-looking. Think moss-covered rocks and scrolls with 2 brush strokes. Kyoto begins to glitter again, not with imperial dignity, but with shogunal swagger. The emperor becomes, once more, a decorative item. Except now, he's split in 2. And historians still argue whether either court truly held legitimacy. Was it the southern court, with its sacred regalia and divine defiance? Or the northern court, which had the bureaucratic muscle, military backing, and a solid supply chain? The answer is frustratingly vague. Because history, as you know too well, isn't always about who's right. Sometimes, it's about who keeps writing the scrolls. Here's a quirky tidbit you might enjoy from beyond the grave. In some remote villages, local festivals still reflect confusion from this era. One mountain town reportedly celebrates both Emperor Days a week apart, just in case. They light lanterns for each line, pour 2 sake bowls, and call it balanced superstition. You know, just in case divine wrath is a little slow to arrive. By the late 1300s, it becomes clear the southern court is losing steam. Supplies dwindle. Morale flickers. Courtiers desert for warmer quarters and actual salaries in Kyoto. Even poetry can't keep the Yoshino court warm in winter. The regalia remains with them, but fewer and fewer people care. And then, finally, something gives. In 1392, the 2 lines negotiate a so-called reconciliation. The southern court agrees to hand over the regalia to the northern court's emperor, now Emperor Gokomatsu, with the understanding that succession will finally alternate fairly between both bloodlines. Oh. You remember how that went last time. Spoiler, it doesn't alternate. Ever again. The Jimmy northern line holds onto the throne, unbroken, from that moment forward. Go-Saga's careful split has, at long last, refused, but not with balance or justice. One branch wins. One disappears into exile, scrolls, and nostalgia. The southern court quietly fades, its poetry anthologies stuffed into temple libraries, its ideals fossilized into righteous footnotes. Some loyalists still whisper that the regalia was faked. That the real sword and mirror were hidden. That one day, the true emperor will return from the mountains. But mostly, people move on. And you, Go-Saga, you strange old emperor with your long, uneventful reign, your legacy is alive in all of it. Not because you wanted chaos, but because your clever compromise, designed to avoid a crisis, merely postponed it for a century. You split the empire to save it. And in doing so, you guaranteed it would eventually tear itself apart just to be whole again. The palace floors in Kyoto creak just the same as they always have, polished cedar, polished not for comfort, but for symbolism, for ceremony. And now that the dust of dynastic war has settled, you'd think peace would finally stretch its lazy arms over the realm. But no. Not quite. Because even as the southern court disappears like a fog burned off by sun, something new starts to shimmer beneath the ash, the rise of the daimyo, the regional warlords. They've been waiting. Watching. hoarding power like squirrels with particularly aggressive swords. This is the era after the Nanboku-ch conflict, and it's often overshadowed in history books by more explosive centuries. But it's critical. It's where the threads of power quietly slide out of the imperial grasp and into provincial hands. Where the roots of future chaos take hold under the mossy calm. And it all starts with a shogunate that begins to sag under its own art collection. The Ashikaga shogunate, for all its elegance, is soft in the middle. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the third shogun, comes to power in the late 1300s and leans hard into culture. He's the one who builds the famous Kinkaku-ji, the Golden Pavilion, a dazzling gold-leafed retreat that makes Go-Saga's taste in architecture look like a mud hut. Yoshimitsu becomes something of a paradox, a military leader who prefers flower arranging. A statesman who settles disputes with poetry contests. And a diplomat who, controversially, accepts the title King of Japan from Ming China, a move that horrifies court conservatives who still see Japan as the center of the divine world order. Historians still argue whether Yoshimitsu's acceptance of that foreign title was savvy pragmatism or outright blasphemy. Either way, it signals a deepening shift. Power isn't just moving from emperors to shoguns anymore, it's flowing toward regional lords who understand trade, steel, and subtle treachery. While Yoshimitsu sips tea in gilded pavilions, the countryside transforms. Daimyo, once vassals, become de facto rulers of their domains. They collect taxes, raise militias, mint their own coins. Some even refuse to attend Kyoto unless absolutely necessary. Others build sprawling castles, not palaces. Their sons are trained not in waka poetry, but in the longbow and siege strategy. And as these provincial warlords grow bolder, the shogunate begins to wobble. You, Go-Saga, once so obsessed with maintaining the illusion of central control, might be horrified, or quietly amused, to see just how far the pendulum has swung. Because now, the emperor is barely a voice in the wind. A ceremonial presence wheeled out for New Year's, then tucked away in brocade and silence. Still, Kyoto maintains its performative sparkle. The imperial family continues to copy sutras, compose courtly laments, and hold annual banquets beneath paper lanterns. But beneath the fanfare, real decisions are being made far away, in the war tents of provincial lords. One particularly sharp quirk of this period. Monks start behaving more like mercenaries. Several Buddhist sects raise their own armies to defend landholdings and intimidate rivals. They call them shei, warrior monks. Imagine a serene, bald man ringing a bell at dawn, then drawing a naginata by lunchtime. Even the shoguns can't fully control them. And often, they don't try. After all, a well-placed monastery could hold the loyalty of thousands, including your tax base. Meanwhile, something new creeps across the land, civil infrastructure born not from the capital, but from necessity. Local lords build irrigation canals. They standardize weights and measures. They issue land surveys. And in doing so, they begin to resemble something very close to governments. The imperial court watches all this unfold with the sort of nervous half-smile you'd wear at a party where you realize you don't actually know the host. They still send out era names and official edicts, but fewer and fewer people care. You can almost imagine the daimyo skimming the latest imperial decree and muttering, that's adorable. Still, there's something uniquely Japanese about this slow decentralization. It isn't an explosion, it's erosion. Power seeps out through cracks no one remembers making. Each village that pledges loyalty to its local lord instead of the shogun, each tax collected directly by a temple instead of the capital, each military alliance formed by clan marriage instead of royal edict, it all chips away at what remains of your old imperial dream. Yet, strangely, it persists. Like a ghost that doesn't know it's dead. Because despite all this decentralization, no one abolishes the emperor. No daimyo declares the throne unnecessary. The court may be powerless, but it remains sacred. Even the Ashikaga shoguns bow to the throne, at least on paper. Every warlord who marches through Kyoto stops just short of violating the emperor's chambers. And that's your doing. You helped engrave that invisible line. You turned the emperor into something that can't be touched, even when no one listens to him anymore. So, while the provinces arm themselves, while Zen monks duel and castle towers rise like teeth, the emperor still watches the seasons change. And the court continues to write poetry about the rain. There's a story from this time, a probably exaggerated one, but delightful nonetheless, about an imperial prince who, upon hearing that another rebellion had broken out near Noro, asked his attendants not, will they attack the capital, but rather, will they disturb the chrysanthemum display? That's where the court is now. Fragile. Removed. Decorative. And in the shadow of this strangely beautiful decay, a deeper tension is coiling, one that will erupt before too long into the full-blown Sengo period. But not yet. For now, the emperor watches, the daimyo posture, and the land tilts ever so slightly toward chaos disguised as elegance. And you, Go-Saga? You're more relevant than you have any right to be. Your quiet decisions echo here, twisted, transformed, and very much alive. The air is cool in Kyoto tonight, heavy with the scent of pine smoke and wet stone. The Kamo River winds its moonlit curve beneath the bridges, silent, unbothered. But the city it passes through is starting to fray again, this time more violently, more permanently. The stillness? It's just the pause before the Sengo storm. And you, long-dead Emperor Go-Saga, you're still here in the scaffolding of it all. Your family sits the throne, yes, but now they do it like museum pieces, draped in brocade and lit softly by ceremonial torchlight, while the rest of Japan sharpens its blades. Because this is the moment the illusion finally cracks. When the balance you tried so hard to strike, between court and warrior, blood and bureaucracy, tips into chaos. Welcome to the 15th century. And welcome to the Nin War. It starts with a succession dispute. Of course it does. You'd recognize the symptoms immediately, two factions, both claiming to act in the interest of stability, but really just spoiling for a fight. Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa, more interested in tea ceremonies than politics, can't seem to pick a clear heir. His brother, his infant son, and half of Kyoto's samurai elite all get tangled in a game of thrones with no rules and too many players. And then it happens, war in the capital. From 1467 to 1477, Kyoto becomes a battleground. Not a metaphorical one, a literal one. Entire districts burn. Noble villas are turned into barracks. Temple bells ring not for prayer but for evacuation. The imperial palace is spared, technically, but it's surrounded by ashen corpses. Factions don't even bother pretending to care about the emperor anymore. They fight each other across city streets like it's a feudal version of dodgeball, using the alleys of Heian as blood-soaked trenches. And what does the emperor do? He sits in the palace, performing rituals to purify a world that no longer listens. And here's your little oddity for the night. Some Kyoto residents during the Nin War continued holding poetry contests in basements, even as flaming arrows thunked into the rafters. Imagine composing a delicate haiku while your neighbor's pagoda collapses next door. Priorities, right? The war eventually fizzles rather than ends. 10 years of stalemate exhaust everyone involved. There's no satisfying victory. No grand treaty. Just smoldering ruins and a shogunate so weakened it can barely govern its own shadow. What follows is arguably Japan's darkest century, the full plunge into the Sengo Jidai, the Warring States period. Think of it as the feudal version of reality TV, non-stop betrayal, surprise alliances, sudden deaths, and absolutely no commercial breaks. Across Japan, daimyo carve out kingdoms of their own, mint coins, raise armies, and dream openly of taking Kyoto, not to restore the emperor, but to rule in his place. Castles sprout on every hilltop. Rice becomes currency. Villages change allegiance weekly depending on whose banners are riding in that morning. And the court? It shrinks. Literally. Imperial estates dwindle. Court nobles sell family heirlooms to pay for firewood. In one rather sad document, a palace official begs for funds to repair a gate hinge, noting the essential dignity of the door. Historians still argue whether the court could have intervened earlier, asserted some flicker of moral authority. But by now, that power is ceremonial at best. Even when shoguns do come to the palace to receive titles or perform rituals, it's more like visiting a very sacred puppet show. The emperor, however, remains strangely untouched. He doesn't vanish. He isn't overthrown. He doesn't even flee. That's the miracle of your legacy, Go-Saga. You helped encode the emperor into the structure of meaning, not power. He became the axis on which the spinning chaos could theoretically rest. Even daimyo who openly ignore court directives still crave the titles the emperor bestows. Being named governor of Kai province by an emperor with no army is still considered an honor. It's absurd. And somehow, it works. The imperial line endures. Even as the provinces burn, even as Japan becomes a patchwork of warlords with the temperament of caffeinated hornets, no one dares abolish the chrysanthemum throne. They just ignore it, politely. But all storms pass eventually. And the Sengo storm? It begins to wear itself out by the late 1500s. You'd hear new names if you were still around. 3 big ones, actually: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Each one more ambitious than the last. Each one determined to reunite Japan, not under the emperor, of course, but under their own banners. Still, they all kneel at the palace gates. Nobunaga re-established control over Kyoto and sends offerings to the court. Hideyoshi builds the massive Jurakudai Palace right next to the emperor's residence, part flex, part tribute. And Tokugawa? He'll do more than offer respect. He'll institutionalize it. But for now, in the flickering candlelight of the late 15th century, the throne remains a glowing ember in the ashes. You'd be pleased to know, Go-Saga, that your descendants, however ornamental, keep performing their sacred rites. They still mark the seasons, chant the old prayers, and maintain the lineage that has not once been broken, even if no one's been listening for quite some time. The Sengo period isn't done with us yet. Not even close. But your legacy? It lingers like incense in a shattered temple. Subtle. Persistent. Inexplicably still sacred. And for now, that's enough. The sun climbs sluggishly over Edo Bay, casting long shadows across the thatched rooftops of a city still waking from centuries of conflict. You hover, spirit-like, over the landscape, watching it breathe again after the storm. The fields, those same fields that once shuddered under the stomping feet of samurai battalions, are now quiet. Rice paddies mirror the sky. Smoke curls from cook fires, not castles under siege. Japan, somehow, has been pulled back together. Not by you, Go-Saga. Not by your descendants, either. But by men with sharper timing, colder strategy, and tighter ledgers. And right now, the sharpest of them all sits in his new capital, Tokugawa Ieyasu. After more than a century of chaos, Ieyasu founds a new regime, the Tokugawa shogunate, in 1603. And just like that, the Sengo madness slams into a brick wall of bureaucracy, curfews, rice audits, and mandatory haircuts. But here's the twist: despite winning the game, Ieyasu doesn't erase the emperor. In fact, he goes out of his way to prop the imperial family back up, like a carefully dusted antique placed prominently on a shelf. Why? Because legitimacy matters. And even though the emperors haven't commanded armies in generations, their symbolism is priceless. You, Go-Saga, built part of that mystique, the idea that the emperor isn't merely a ruler, but a source. A source of divine continuity, celestial endorsement, and political juju. You built a throne no one could quite touch, or discard. So the Tokugawa keep the emperor, on a very short leash. Kyoto becomes a kind of holy museum. The court receives just enough funding to function, but not enough to act. Imperial rituals continue, carefully watched. The emperor appoints the shogun, officially. The shogun governs everything, actually. The system is almost elegant in its hypocrisy. Imperial rituals continue, carefully watched. The emperor appoints the shogun, officially. The shogun governs everything, actually. The system is almost elegant in its hypocrisy. Historians still argue whether Ieyasu respected the imperial institution or simply exploited it. Was it reverence or a PR campaign? Either way, he ensures the emperor is revered as sacred and irrelevant in equal measure. You'd appreciate the irony. You try to keep the court alive through compromise. Aiju keeps it alive through containment. Meanwhile, Edo, modern-day Tokyo, becomes the real center of gravity. The shogunate enforces peace with an iron fan. Lords are required to travel to Edo regularly and leave their families behind as hostages, a policy known as Sankin-keitai. This isn't governance, it's babysitting by way of feudal guilt trips. But here's a fun quirk: the emperor, though powerless, becomes a kind of living artifact for scholars, poets, and even some eccentric samurai. You'll be amused to hear that certain daimyo take up ancient courtly arts, calligraphy, incense blending, even Heian-style poetry, just to emulate the imperial ideal. Imagine a tattooed warrior reciting love poems in archaic Japanese while polishing his katana. It happened. And speaking of poetry, the court becomes a training ground for what we might call soft power. Nobles teach aesthetics to rich merchant sons. They run salons. They debate grammar and issue scrolls with perfect brushstrokes. Some even become cultural influencers in a world increasingly obsessed with order and appearances. Still, life in the palace is no fairy tale. The court is poor. Sometimes scandalously so. Robes are re-dyed to cover wear. Meals are simple, even sparse. At one point in the 1600s, an imperial princess reportedly wore ceremonial shoes made of lacquered paper because leather was too expensive. Just imagine announcing the arrival of divinity with a gentle crunch. And yet, the symbolism holds. The emperor's signature still graces shogunal appointments. Era names still come from the palace. The chrysanthemum throne is still the throne, even if it's now more of a cushion with really strict rules about who can sit on it. There's even a resurgence of religious legitimacy. The emperor, seen as a descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, becomes central again in state-sponsored Shinto rituals. Not to govern, but to sanctify. You'd call it a spiritual comeback tour. And here's where the story gets strangely cozy. Under the Tokugawa, Japan closes itself off to the world in a policy known as sakoku. Foreign missionaries are expelled. Trade is restricted to a few carefully monitored ports. No one gets in. No one gets out. It's the feudal version of locking your doors and pulling the blinds because you heard a weird noise outside. In this locked box nation, the emperor becomes both more distant and more essential. He's not just the relic of domestic tradition, he becomes a symbol of untouched Japaneseness. A pristine node of identity in a country that's deliberately sealed off from foreign influence. And this, dear Go-Saga, is perhaps your strangest legacy. You helped usher in a system where the emperor was insulated, elevated, neutered, and revered, all at once. And now, that same strange cocktail of respect and irrelevance has become national policy. Tokugawa Ieyasu might have had the sharper blade. But you had the longer game. Back in Kyoto, the court persists in its dreamy rituals. You can almost hear it, the rustle of layered silk, the faint echo of a koto string, the murmured lines of a 1,000-year-old poem about mist. The outside world may be shifting, but inside those walls, time still moves like honey. Of course, no stasis lasts forever. Cracks are already forming, economic strains, growing merchant wealth, peasant unrest. But the illusion of permanence holds. For now. And that's the lull. The quiet breath before modernity. The long dusk before a fire someone hasn't struck yet. Your descendants sleep in the palace still. Not ruling, but watching. The year is 1853, and the piece is about to shatter like a porcelain teacup meeting a cannonball. You drift low over Edo Bay again, where strange black ships bob in the water like thunderclouds caught at sea. Their smokestacks belch soot. Their cannons glint in the summer sun. These are not the usual trade vessels the Tokugawa shogunate likes to monitor with its magnifying glass and TSKS. No, these are American steamships under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry, and they've come to knock on Japan's front door, with gunpowder in hand and the smug confidence of manifest destiny. This, dear Go-Saga, is the end of isolation. When those ships arrive, Japan hasn't dealt with serious foreign intrusion in over 200 years. And what's the emperor doing during this maritime drama? Sitting in Kyoto, of course. Quietly. Ceremonially. Totally sidelined. The Tokugawa government tries to stall, bluff, and squint really hard until the foreign ships go away. Spoiler, they don't. Within a year, Japan signs the Treaty of Kanagawa. It opens 2 ports to American ships and guarantees the safety of shipwrecked sailors. It's the first of many unequal treaties, and it marks the beginning of the end for Tokugawa rule. But it also marks something else, a strange reawakening of imperial relevance. You see, people start whispering again. About the emperor. About divine authority. About how the shogunate, for all its power, just folded like a cheap paper screen to foreign demands. National pride sags. Samurai grow restless. Scholars dig up ancient texts like fossils, brushing dust off ideologies that smell suspiciously like revolution. One philosophy in particular starts to glow hot: Sonji, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Catchy, huh? It's part political theory, part marketing slogan. And suddenly, the emperor becomes more than a figurehead, he becomes a rallying point. Like the forgotten sacred sword in the attic, pulled down just in time for the final battle. Historians still argue whether the imperial court had any real agency in what comes next. But the perception is that the emperor represents untainted Japanese identity, free of foreign corruption. And that's powerful enough. By the 1860s, anti-shogunate movements gain momentum. Samurai from Satsuma and CHSH domains, 2 of the more militant feudal regions, begin to coordinate. They want to bring down the Tokugawa, and they want to do it in the emperor's name. The emperor at this moment is Emperor Kamei, Go-Saga's great-great-great dash, insert about 20 more greats, grandson. He's not exactly a firebrand, but he hates foreigners, and he doesn't love being a shogunate prop. When he dies unexpectedly in 1867, his teenage son Matsuhito takes the throne. And Matsuhito? He's about to blow the chrysanthemum petals off the entire table. Within a year, the Tokugawa regime is formally dismantled. The Meiji Restoration is declared. Power is restored to the emperor, although, let's be honest, it's not the same kind of power you knew, Go-Saga. It's modern, centralized, bureaucratic, and styled after Western nations. Still, it's real power again. For the first time in over 600 years, the emperor actually governs. Cue the national rebranding. Matsuhito becomes Emperor Meiji, and he becomes the face of a rapidly modernizing Japan. Feudal domains are replaced with prefectures. Samurai privileges are abolished. A national conscripted army is formed. Railroads stretch their iron fingers across the land. Telephones ring. Factories rise. Top knots fall. And here's the real twist: all this westernization is packaged not as abandonment of tradition, but as fulfillment of it. The emperor is positioned as the ultimate modernizer and timeless symbol. The throne is the axis of progress and continuity. It's brilliant, cynical, almost poetic. And your fingerprints are still faintly visible in the framing. Remember how you helped fuse religious ceremony with political continuity? That blend becomes a cornerstone of Meiji ideology. The emperor is no longer a ceremonial monk with fancy robes and bad funding, he's now the living soul of the nation, armed with a constitutional monarchy and a fresh suit. A mainstream historical fact for your scrapbook: in 1889, Japan adopts the Meiji Constitution. It establishes the emperor as the sovereign ruler with divine origins. It's modeled partly on the Prussian constitution, because nothing says modern empire like borrowing from militarized Germany. But, and here's your quirky tidbit, despite all this modernization, the emperor continues to perform ancient Shinto rites in secret. Some rituals date back to your own time, Go-Saga. Imagine donning a 3-meter-long train of silk robes to whisper prayers to harvest gods, right before attending a cabinet meeting about installing streetcars in Nagoya. The Meiji court becomes a symbol machine. Statues go up. School children memorize imperial edicts. Textbooks describe the emperor as both father of the people and direct descendant of the sun goddess. It's not quite divine right, not quite nationalism, and definitely not optional. This tight fusion of modern statecraft and mythological legitimacy is something new and dangerous. Like mixing gasoline and incense. But you might feel a flash of satisfaction watching it unfold. Your line, the same line you fought to preserve through marriages and maneuvering, has risen from the shadows. The court that once rationed lamp oil now drafts laws, commands armies, and negotiates treaties with Britain and Russia. It's surreal. And it doesn't stop there. Japan, under Meiji, becomes an empire. Korea is annexed. Taiwan becomes a colony. War looms again, but this time, Japan isn't defending itself from black ships. It's sailing its own fleet across the Pacific. The emperor's face appears on stamps, coins, even sake bottles. It's branding on a national scale. If Go-Saga could see this, you might blink twice and ask, wait, he's the emperor. Because it's not robes and incense anymore. It's uniforms, medals, and Western-style ballrooms. And the people? They believe. Or at least, they obey. Because for the first time in centuries, the emperor isn't just a name in a palace. He's a presence. A power. The wheel has turned again. And the chrysanthemum throne, dusty but intact, now casts a longer shadow than it ever did in your lifetime. But shadows can deepen. And storms gather quickly. And soon, the very thing that saved the imperial institution, its mythical sanctity, will be weaponized in ways that shake the entire world. But not yet. For now, the empire is rising. The streets of Tokyo buzz with electricity. Factories churn. Soldiers march. And in the heart of it all, the emperor stands, radiant, remote, and real. Now you drift above Tokyo, no longer Edo, a city pulsing with the kind of energy that burns too fast. Gas lamps flicker across foreign-style boulevards. Brick buildings rise beside paper-walled homes. Western suits strut past kimonoed vendors. You're watching a Japan that's sprinting into modernity, tripping occasionally, but always getting back up, eyes set on empire. At the center of it all, the emperor. Still technically divine, but now also, alarmingly human-shaped. Cameras catch his profile. School children chant his virtues. Every newspaper headline makes room for imperial praise, no matter the article. You, Go-Saga, once prayed for your ancestors in quiet court ceremonies. Now your descendant is being worshipped on posters. And yet, the job of emperor in the Meiji era is complicated. Emperor Meiji isn't exactly calling every shot. He's part of a constitutional monarchy, after all, but his role in shaping Japan's national identity is colossal. He performs sacred rites in the palace one day and reviews military parades the next. It's ceremony, sure. But it's also performance art, nationalism, propaganda, and spiritual glue. By the early 20th century, Japan has done the unthinkable, become a global power. It defeats China in 1895. Then Russia in 1905. The West starts eyeing Japan not as an exotic curiosity, but as a rival. Some even call it the Britain of the East. That's flattering, if slightly passive-aggressive. But as Japan expands outward, Korea, Manchuria, and later deeper into China, the role of the emperor shifts again. From spiritual figurehead to imperial rallying point. And here's the pivot you'll want to pay attention to. After Emperor Meiji's death in 1912, his son Taeish takes the throne. But Taeish suffers from poor health and possible neurological issues. As a result, actual governance shifts even further toward advisors and the military. The emperor becomes a quieter presence, even as his image continues to loom large in public life. Historians still argue whether this dilution of real authority contributed to Japan's radicalization. With no strong imperial voice to moderate policy, militarists rise, unchecked. Civilian governments falter. Ambitious generals and ultranationalists begin speaking on behalf of the emperor, without necessarily having his full consent. And this is where things begin to tilt dangerously. In 1926, Hirohito, posthumously known as Emperor Shuo, ascends the throne. He's only 25, serious, educated, and eerily calm. The world he inherits is already brewing with tension. The Great Depression hits. Trade slows. Western powers tighten immigration policies. Japan feels insulted, isolated, hungry for resources and respect. The military offers a solution: conquest. And here's the part you won't believe: Go-Saga. The same throne you once fought to preserve through poetry and genealogy becomes the ideological center of a full-blown war machine. The concept of kokutai, national essence, emerges, combining Shinto divinity, ultra-loyalty to the emperor, and absolute submission to the state. It's not just patriotism. It's near-religious fervor. Emperor Hirohito's face appears everywhere, from cigarette packs to classroom walls. Teachers lead students in daily prostrations toward the imperial palace. Soldiers swear oaths to die for him. Suicide pilots, kamikaze, write farewell poems invoking his name. You wanted reverence, Go-Saga. This is something else entirely. Still, Hirohito remains publicly silent. His role during this descent into militarism is one of the most hotly contested debates in modern historiography. Some say he was merely a constitutional monarch, bound by cabinet decisions. Others argue he was more involved than his polite, glove-wearing demeanor suggests. Did he approve the invasion of China? Did he sanction the attack on Pearl Harbor? Did he merely accept what was happening, or actively direct it? We may never know with certainty. Records were burned. Testimonies edited. But the end result is undeniable: Japan hurtles into World War II with the Emperor as its guiding star. And as the Pacific burns, the cost is unimaginable. Cities fall. Millions die. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which promised liberation from Western colonialism, becomes a brutal empire marked by forced labor, mass killings, and systemic violence. Your descendants, Go-Saga, are no longer just symbols. They've become war gods. And then, boom. August the 6th, 1945. Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki. 2 atomic bombs. One imperial nation brought to its knees. And in the rubble, the most surreal moment in imperial history occurs. For the first time ever, the emperor speaks directly to the people. It's called the Gyokuan-HS, dual voice broadcast. On August 15, 1945, Hirohito's voice crackles across the radio waves. His Japanese is so formal, so elevated, that most listeners barely understand him. But one thing is clear: Japan has surrendered. He does not apologize. He does not admit guilt. But he says, softly, that the time has come to endure the unendurable. Imagine that. The descendant of the sun goddess, divine by blood, speaking defeat aloud. Your line, Go-Saga, survives, but everything has changed. In the weeks that follow, American occupation begins. General Douglas MacArthur arrives. Japan is disarmed. War criminals are tried. A new constitution is drafted, one that strips the emperor of all political power. Article 1 reads, the emperor shall be the symbol of the state and of the unity of the people. That's it. Just a symbol. No more commands. No more divinity. In fact, Hirohito formally renounces his divine status in a New Year's speech in 1946. The gods of old are now historical metaphors. Quirky tidbit? After the surrender, American occupation forces were advised not to remove the emperor outright, fearing it would provoke rebellion. So Hirohito stays, an untouched figurehead in a conquered nation. He even takes up marine biology and becomes known for his jellyfish studies. Yes. Jellyfish. The former god of war now catalogues cnidarians in his spare time. As Tokyo rebuilds, one subway station, one neon sign at a time, the imperial family transitions again. Not into power, but into permanence. The emperor becomes a kind of national grandfather. Calm. Distant. Ceremonial. And you, Go-Saga, from your ancient perch, might finally exhale. Because the throne you protected through scrolls and silks has survived black ships, bombers, and bureaucracy. The reign continues. Not as command, but as continuity. Not as rule, but as ritual. So here you are, bedtime explorer, hovering gently over post-war Japan. It's the late 1940s, and the air smells of dust and ramen broth, of radio static and rain on scorched concrete. The cities are flattened, yes, but somehow bustling. Bicycles dart through streets without buildings. Children in patched-up uniforms carry tin lunch boxes. Women queue for rice, while black markets hum just around the corner. The country is broken, but waking. And in the middle of it all, like a quiet ghost that refused to vanish, the emperor remains. Hirohito, once a divine presence whose name no commoner dared utter aloud, now attends public ceremonies with a small, awkward wave. His silks have been replaced with a Western suit and tie. No more divine glint, just a man with rimmed glasses, photographed next to MacArthur, the American general towering beside him like a cardboard cutout of post-war irony. But your old office, Go-Saga, still stands. Not in power, but in posture. The imperial court has been stripped of any role in politics, and yet, it's still there. Polished. Pressed. Ceremonial to a fault. What's left of your lineage's authority now exists mostly in chrysanthemum symbols and tightly choreographed rituals. The emperor presides over things, not rules them. He dedicates new Shinkansen train lines, opens national sports festivals, and appears during the enthronement of other royals abroad. He's a soft presence in a nation that has grown cautious of hard ones. Meanwhile, the Constitution, passed in 1947, clearly defines the emperor as a symbol of the state and the unity of the people. A lovely phrase, but also frustratingly vague. What does it mean to be a symbol? Historians still argue whether this framing was genius political compromise or a poetic sidestep. Either way, it works. Japan becomes a democracy. The Diet holds power. Prime ministers come and go. But the emperor endures, like the moon above the river, silent, steady, a reference point no matter how wild the waters below. And here's a quirky little footnote for you. The Imperial Household Agency, which oversees the Emperor's affairs, is famously secretive and bureaucratic, like a cross between a royal nanny service and a time capsule museum. For decades, they refused to let anyone take candid photos of Hirohito smiling. Too human, they said. Too risky. Can't let the symbol crack a grin. But grins start sneaking in anyway. Japan, under United States guidance and native resilience, rebuilds at a pace that makes the world blink. Highways knit the islands together. Bullet trains hum across rice paddies. Electronics firms boom. The economy explodes into what becomes known as the Japanese miracle. Through it all, Hirohito, still emperor, becomes a kind of national background music. Never too loud, never out of tune. By the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, he's standing in the stadium, waving gently again. Japan is rebranding itself, and he's been rebranded along with it. From wartime god to constitutional ghost to national mascot. But the shadows don't vanish. Protests bubble up. Especially in the 1960s and 70s, leftist student movements take to the streets. Some demand the complete abolition of the monarchy, still blaming Hirohito for the horrors of the war. Others want him tried. Public sentiment divides, some cling to him as the last string tying the present to the past. Others view him as a relic best left in a museum next to feudal swords and World War II helmets. By the 1980s, Hirohito's health starts failing. And as the end approaches, the question looms, what now? What happens to a symbol when it dies? In 1989, the emperor dies. Japan mourns, not with shrieking lament, but with quiet, formal nods and long lines of bowed heads. The chrysanthemum throne passes to his son, Akihito, who takes the name of the Heisei era. Now here's where things get tender, Go-Saga. Akihito, born in 1933, grows up amidst rubble, then restraint, then renewal. Unlike his father, he chooses to walk among the people. He visits disaster zones personally. He speaks in everyday Japanese. He marries a commoner, Michiko, sending shockwaves through the old courtly ranks who still dream in Heian poetry and powdered wigs. But Akihito doesn't care. He plays the cello. He studies fish. He holds his wife's hand on camera. This emperor is not a god. He's a grandfather. During his reign, Akihito quietly redefines what it means to be emperor in a modern, pacifist Japan. His actions, while small and ceremonial, are often deeply symbolic. He expresses remorse for Japan's wartime actions. He visits sites of battle and offers prayers. He never apologizes directly, that would violate the carefully neutral role he's been assigned, but his intent is clear. And here's a lovely fringe tidbit: Akihito is the first emperor in history to write a scholarly article in English. The subject? Gobies. Yes, the fish. He publishes in Science. Imagine that, your 125th generation successor, Go-Saga, not only survives the nuclear age but gets peer-reviewed for fish taxonomy. You'd be proud. Yet even Okihito faces tension with the bureaucrats at the Imperial Household Agency. He wants to retire, citing age and health. They resist, fearing the precedent it might set. After all, emperors don't resign. They endure. But Okihito pushes gently, politely, because pushing impolitely is simply not done in this world of pressed kimono folds and perfect bowing angles. Finally, in 2019, the law is changed to allow abdication. Okihito steps down, and his son Naruhito ascends. A new era is declared, Reiwa, meaning beautiful harmony. Another page. Another title. Another soft shuffle forward. A new Go-Saga, float higher still, over a Japan of LED screens and vending machines, of typhoon shelters and cherry blossom forecasts. A nation forever rewriting its story, never forgetting its symbols. The emperor still performs seasonal rites. He still welcomes foreign ambassadors. He still wears those ancient garments for certain ceremonies, robes whose stitching patterns haven't changed since your own twilight years. He even tends to imperial rice paddies each spring. Not because it matters agriculturally, but because it matters mythically. And people still come. They gather on New Year's Day at the palace gates, waiting for a glimpse, a wave, a whisper of that unbroken line. It's been nearly 800 years since you first recited your name before the sacred mirror. Since you wrestled for regency, then faded into the shadow of shoguns. And yet, the line holds. Just a symbol? No. Something softer. Something stranger. A memory that breathes. And in the next and final section, dear explorer, you'll sink slowly back through the centuries. We'll pull the curtains closed on your long, quiet reign, and watch the echoes fade, gently, into silence. You begin your descent now, not in body, but in rhythm. The present, with its chrome and concrete, recedes like a dream after waking. You drift back, past glowing bullet trains and stoic emperors waving behind glass, slipping through the ages, tracing the fading ink lines of calligraphy and sandal prints worn into temple stones. You land again in the 13th century. Kyoto smells of wet pine and ceremonial incense. Courtiers pass in pairs beneath hanging lanterns, their sleeves brushing the ground like whispers. This is your world, Go-Saga. A world quieter than any time that followed, but not because it lacked ambition. No, your time was simply tuned to a different frequency. Now that we've seen what your line became, let's slide once more into the crevices of your own reign, that long, drifting stretch between youth and finality. You've abdicated the throne by now, technically. Your son, Go-Fukakusa, has taken your place. But let's not pretend. You still pull the strings. The cloistered emperor was a peculiar invention of your era, a way to keep power within reach while dodging the formal burdens of court. And you play it well. In your polished slippers and subtle nods, you guide succession, influence policy, and make sure your branch of the family keeps its footing. Ah, but remember the plan? Remember when you engineered that seesaw system of alternating emperors from different family lines, just to keep the peace? You thought you were being clever. Historians still argue whether it was elegant diplomacy or a slow-motion catastrophe. Because, dear Go-Saga, the seesaw didn't stop seesawing. In fact, it never stopped at all. Generations after you, this fragile balance collapses into bitter rivalry between the northern and southern courts. For 60 years, rival emperors claim legitimacy, and your carefully braided imperial family tears itself apart like a silk screen in a windstorm. But for now, in your own time, the illusion of harmony holds. You continue to write poetry. You officiate religious rituals. You contribute to the imperial anthologies. Your mind remains sharp, even as your legs grow weary. You become a symbol of steadiness, a soft weight anchoring Kyoto during a time when the world beyond its walls begins to change more rapidly than you could have predicted. Outside your court, the Kamakura shogunate grows less composed. The regents, once clear-headed and confident, start behaving like suspicious uncles at a family inheritance meeting. Factionalism creeps in. Samurai squabble over appointments. Taxes are harder to collect. You hear whispers of unrest, small uprisings, murmurs of lost loyalty. But it all feels far away, like thunder in a neighboring valley. And then, another echo you could never have predicted, the Mongols. Yes, those Mongols. While you're reciting waka poetry and pouring sake with a gentle tilt, a storm is brewing on the mainland. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, is expanding west, east, and wherever else his horses will carry him. In 1266, Kublai sends the first of many diplomatic letters to Japan. Their politely worded threats, submit to our emperor or else. The Kamakura Bakufu intercepts these letters, not you. In fact, you're mostly kept out of foreign affairs. But word reaches you in whispers, scrolls passed discreetly by loyal monks. You read them at twilight, one eyebrow raised. You'd think the Kamakura shogunate might take the threat seriously. Instead, they do nothing. Not at first. They assume the Mongols can't reach Japan. They assume that the sea, the divine boundary, will protect the islands. You, meanwhile, return to your poetry. And yet, the sea doesn't scare the Mongols. In 1274, they arrive with ships, hundreds of them. Korean-built, Chinese-manned, Mongol-led. They land in Kyushu and wreak havoc with advanced weaponry, gunpowder bombs, steel-tipped arrows, unfamiliar formations. Samurai, who are used to fighting one-on-one like it's a fencing duel with extra grunting, are thrown into chaos. And then, a typhoon? Nature herself, the divine storm, comes roaring down like an old god with a bone to pick. The invaders are destroyed by wind and wave. Japan is saved, not by planning, but by weather. The kamikaze, divine wind, enters legend. You're dead by then. But your memory lingers. Because in those final years of your life, as the world grows less stable, your reign comes to be viewed as the last quiet moment. A golden dusk before the long civil twilights. Your name carries a kind of wistful weight. Go-Saga's time, people say, was orderly. Quirky tidbit? The palace records from your era include an official complaint about the quality of incense being delivered to court. yes. Amid all the chaos, someone had the gall to submit a scroll saying the sandalwood was too smoky. You might have signed off on it. Priorities. And yet, you weren't oblivious. You knew the shogunate's power would not last forever. You knew your heirs might one day find themselves pawns, not players. You tried to build a throne that could flex, bend, survive. You succeeded, sort of. Because your descendants, as we've seen, endured everything from Mongol invasions to nuclear bombs. Your reign, uneventful as it may have seemed, was the slow weaving of a net that caught an entire nation's identity and held it in place while the storms raged. So, what's your legacy? Historians shrug. He didn't do much, they say. But they're wrong. You preserved. You maintained. You curated continuity like a sacred flame. You understood, better than most, that the imperial throne is not always a seat of action, it is a mirror, a scroll, a heartbeat. And your heartbeat, Go-Saga, kept time for centuries. You fade now, not as a conqueror or a martyr, but as a lull in the music, a soft drum behind the fanfare. And as the ages carry on without you, your quiet reign becomes a kind of refuge in the Japanese historical memory. A moment when the storm held its breath. And now, in our final section, we'll breathe out, long and slow, and settle beneath the weight of all you were, and all you helped carry forward. The lanterns flicker low. You lie back, not in a palace bed or the mossy silence of a cloister, but within the soft folds of memory itself. Time hums around you, gently now, like the strings of a bee were brushed by a patient hand. You've traveled so far, bedtime explorer. Through centuries of silk and steel, thunder and stillness. And here, in the final breath of Go-Saga's journey, we slow down, just enough to see what lingers in the dust. Your death is quiet. It comes in 1272, after decades spent behind court screens, dressed in ritual robes you helped define. You're not assassinated, not exiled, not felled in battle. You slip away in the most Go-Saga way possible, with very little fanfare. Just another cloudy day in Kyoto. A few courtiers weep, a few priests chant sutras. And then the world rolls forward. The record keepers log your passing with the same calligraphic strokes they used to record plum blossom festivals and the births of royal cats. You are gone, but your reign? It lingers, like scent clinging to the collar of an old coat. Now, remember that bifurcated succession plan you set in motion? Well, by the early 1300s, it spirals wildly. The alternating rule between the Jimmuan and Daikakuji imperial lines becomes a chess match soaked in incense and ego. Two branches, both noble, both utterly convinced they are the legitimate line. Civil war brews. Eventually, Japan enters the Nanboku siege period, the age of the northern and southern courts. Two emperors. Two thrones. Two seals. And countless headaches for historians ever since. And yet, both sides trace their right to rule back to you. You become the fulcrum of a dynastic seesaw that never fully settles. In a strange twist, your long, steady reign becomes the reference point for generations of legitimacy claims, forged documents, and symbolic rituals. Your name is stamped into court petitions, echoed in lineage charts, and debated in whispered tones by scholars who wear more ink than armor. Historians still argue whether you created a brilliant mechanism for power sharing, or an unworkable truce doomed to fracture. But here's the kicker: even in their arguments, they acknowledge something essential. You mattered. And here's a curious footnote: despite being a retired emperor for longer than you ruled, your decisions during that twilight time shaped more than any decree from your official seat. You wielded the soft power of ritual and influence better than most wielded swords. Modern researchers sometimes gloss over you in textbooks. No great battles. No scandal. No revolutionary policies. But when they pause to look closer, to follow the threads you spun into the imperial weave, they blink. Because your reign, sleepy though it seemed, acted like glue. Invisible but holding everything together. A whisper holds more than a shout, after all. Your descendants carry on. Through famine. Through shogun and puppet regimes. Through fires, earthquakes, and modern parliaments. Your name, Go-Saga, is rarely shouted from balconies, but it echoes in family trees, in imperial rituals, and in the very fact that the institution you shaped is still standing. And even the modern emperors, quiet Akihito, reserved Naruhito, live inside your blueprint. They balance symbolism and soft diplomacy because you showed them how. You crafted the role of a ruler who isn't ruling but isn't irrelevant. A keeper of continuity. A candle in the alcove. But before we let go, let's revisit your world one final time. The Heian palaces are crumbling slightly at the edges now. Paper doors stick in their tracks. The gold leaf on shrine carvings is peeling. The court poets are aging, their metaphors repeat. The seasons still change, but something under the surface feels different. The pulse is faint. And yet, even in this late hour, you sit with a calm you've cultivated over decades. You sip tea that tastes slightly of pine. You close your eyes during morning sutras and know the words by heart. You watch cranes fly in slow arcs over the Kamo River and murmur a poem only you will ever hear. Quirky detail for this final stretch. Legend says one of your favorite pastimes as a retired emperor was watching ink dry. Literally. You would write verses in the early morning and spend the next hour watching them fade from glossy to matte on fine paper. Meditation through evaporation. That's commitment. Eventually, your remains are buried not far from Kyoto, in a quiet imperial tomb where crows gather, but few tourists tread. There's no massive statue, no towering gate. Just earth, stone, and time. But Go-Saga, you're not just in that tomb. You're in every ceremonial rice planting carried out by emperors centuries after your death. You're in the alternating rhythms of court succession, even the absurd ones. You're in the soft vowels of courtly speech, the musical notes of gagaku echoing through empty throne rooms. You're in the moment an emperor bows, not from power, but from respect. And more than anything, you're in the silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence so constant it doesn't need noise. That is your reign. Not uneventful. Just unshaken. And now, as we move toward the wind down, you can feel it, the soft breath of finality on your cheeks, like the faintest breeze beneath a silk curtain. The story is almost over. But your place in it, like a stone in a stream, remains, quiet, patient, unmoved. You lie still, soft as the lacquered halls of Kyoto in winter. Nothing creaks anymore, not even time. Go-Saga's shadow has lengthened into myth, but myth doesn't always come with thunder and fire. Sometimes, it just stays. Like a lantern no one dares extinguish. The centuries move on without asking your permission. They stomp through rice fields and battlefield fog, scribble new names in the imperial almanac, and shuffle your descendants around like chess pieces, sometimes noble, sometimes puppets. And still, your legacy endures in strange places. Take the imperial rituals. They're dusty, deeply obscure, and yet somehow, unbroken. The Daijisai harvest rite? Still performed. The emperor's enthronement processions? Still choreographed like no theater, even today. Guess who codified and quietly enforced those back when everything was hanging by a silken thread? You, sleepy monarch. Go-Saga. Even your flair for alternating airs, though it got, well, messy, became precedent. In times of crisis, the Japanese court has occasionally leaned back on your precedent like an old futon, slightly uneven, faintly fragrant, but comfortingly there. And yet, for every ritual that survived, there were a dozen cracks forming around the imperial institution itself. Remember the shogunate? That handy military babysitter you once tiptoed around? Yeah. It gets worse. After your death, the Kamakura Bakufu drags on a little longer, weathering the first Mongol invasion thanks to a fortuitous typhoon. But by the second invasion in 1281, Japan is exhausted. Even another divine wind can't fully undo the damage. The shogunate's finances are wrecked from non-stop defense building, and the samurai? They're grumpy. Promised land that never came. Letters unanswered. Swords getting rusty from bureaucracy. By the early 1300s, things unravel fast. Go-Daigo, your descendant, of course, decides he's done playing polite emperor. He wants real power. The kind that moves armies, not just incense burners. In 1333, he rises up, manages to topple the Kamakura shogunate, and reinstates direct imperial rule. A bold move. Heroic, even. But it doesn't last. Go-Daigo is deposed within a few short years by Ashikaga Takauji, who installs a rival emperor from the other branch of your family tree. That alternating succession plan of yours? It's now a full-blown family brawl, like a dinner party gone nuclear. The southern and northern courts split in 1336. Both claim descent from you. Both refuse to recognize the other. And both dig in for nearly 6 decades of shadowy reigns, secret ceremonies, and poetry wars. Yes, there were actual poetry duels between the courts, savagely polite, but savage nonetheless. Historians still argue whether this bifurcation was your fault, Go-Saga, or whether it was inevitable, given the delicate architecture of power you'd left behind. One scholar wrote, "He designed a house with 2 front doors and forgot to label the keys." Ouch. But also, fair. So where does that leave us? In a deeply Japanese paradox. Because while the institution splintered and regathered, fractured and flowed, it never died. The emperors kept breathing, bowing, blessing. The court adapted by retreating, then advancing, then hiding again like a fox in the reeds. By the 15th century, the Ashikaga shogunate rules Japan in all but name. The emperor becomes a distant figure, part relic, part holy symbol. Still necessary, still sacred, but mostly ornamental. And yet, through that ornamental veneer, threads of your design persist. Your anthologies, your rituals, your way of quietly influencing from behind a screen. Quirky tidbit, even centuries later, during the Edo period, imperial family members were sometimes required to consult ancient precedents from your reign to resolve ceremonial disputes. Imagine being dragged out of a tea ceremony because someone's citing Go-Saga's interpretation of the appropriate sleeve width for midsummer court dances. Bureaucracy can be eternal. As modernity creeps in, first with the black ships of Commodore Perry in the 1850s, then with Major's whirlwind reforms, you might expect the imperial institution to crumble. Instead, it mutates. By the late 19th century, the emperor is no longer a recluse priest but a symbol of national identity. The Meiji emperor becomes a rallying figure for industrialization, militarization, and eventually, national myth-making on a terrifying scale. Your descendants are now embedded in banknotes, textbooks, even battlefield flags. The imperial throne is reborn, and yet, still yours. Still echoing your blend of ritual, restraint, and divine distance. And it's not all glory. By the time World War II arrives, the throne becomes entangled in militarist propaganda. Your line is no longer just symbolic, it's weaponized. And when the dust settles in 1945, Japan is forced to confront what the emperor is. Emperor Hirohito renounces his divine status in a radio broadcast heard around the world. He remains on the throne, but as a symbol of the state, a phrase as delicate as your best waka verse. And even now, right now, the current emperor, Naruhito, can trace his family line back to you. He performs rites you safeguarded. He sits on a throne you once warmed. He walks a narrow path of influence without power, grace without decree. Just like you. So Go-Saga, for a man who supposedly did nothing, your fingerprints are all over the present. No wars. No grand reforms. No coups or epics. And yet, you lasted. And in a way, you taught the entire institution how to last. Not by domination. Not by grandeur. But by being patient. By watching. By enduring, quietly, until the storm passed. And now, dear explorer, just 2 chapters remain. The lights are low. The incense has burned down to the stem. And we're almost ready to drift into the softest silence of all. You exhale slowly. Not because you're tired, but because the story has softened into breath itself. The palace is gone now. The courtiers, the lacquered halls, the elaborate silences, all faded into memory like brushstrokes on a scroll long since rolled and shelved. But you remain. Not in form, perhaps, but in rhythm, in echo. And now, the modern world stands around you, unaware that it treads on your quiet path. Post-war Japan is very different, of course. Neon signs buzz where torches once flickered. Bullet trains roar through mountains where monks once hiked with prayer beads. And the emperor? Well, he's still there. Not as a god. Not as a ruler. As a symbol. A living piece of continuity. And that, curiously, is exactly the role you carved out for yourself centuries before anyone called it modern. Let's talk about Akihito for a moment. The 125th Emperor of Japan, and the first to marry a commoner, Michiko. He was born into a world at war, bowed to General MacArthur as a boy, and spent decades healing the wounds of an empire that once believed it could swallow Asia whole. But Akihito ruled like you, quietly. He made pilgrimages to disaster zones, tended to ancient rituals, and once, famously, whispered regret for Japan's wartime aggression, a move that split pundits but soothed many hearts. He abdicated in 2019, the first emperor to do so in over 2 centuries. And his successor, Naruhito, your direct descendant, rules now in the Reiwa era. He's a former Oxford student, a water management specialist, a soft-spoken figure with the posture of someone who knows exactly how fragile symbols can be. But he too performs rites you preserved. Every harvest festival, every enthronement bow, every seasonal reflection delivered with exacting humility, it all circles back to your reign, that long stretch of quietness that became the model for emperorship in a world always one tremor away from chaos. Now, lean in close. Because here's a fringe tidbit you'll love, in the imperial archives, buried deep in rarely accessed scrolls, there's supposedly a poem, unsigned, that scholars think might have been written by you in retirement. It's not particularly elegant, not masterful by court standards. But it's tender. The pine does not speak, but holds its shape in snowstorms. So too shall I stay. Some dismiss it. Others insist it captures your essence better than 1,000 genealogies. Historians still argue whether it's truly yours. But it doesn't matter, really. The idea of you, still holding shape beneath the drift of centuries, feels right. Now step back with me. Zoom out from the chambers and scepters, the family trees and ritual garb. What do you see? A nation that transformed more radically than almost any other, yet kept its imperial thread intact. A people who reinvented everything, language, law, architecture, cuisine, but still watched their emperor plant rice with a wooden hoe once a year. That's not political power. That's cultural gravity. You, Go-Saga, became that gravity. Not flashy, not revolutionary, but steady, enduring. Proof that sometimes, the quietest reigns shape the loudest centuries. And perhaps, at long last, we should let you rest. Not in a tomb, but in the stillness between names. The breath between eras. Your life was not a crescendo, but a hum. A tuning fork held up to the sky, waiting for time to match its tone. And it did. So the next time someone tells you history only remembers warriors and conquerors, you can smile gently from the shadows and say, "Ah, but even mountains bow to the moonlight." That's the story you've left us with. One final note before we settle into silence. Your line continues. Whether it's symbolic or sacred, ceremonial or heartfelt, the imperial family of Japan still honors the rights you helped define. Even now, in the 21st century, amidst social media storms and climate uncertainty, a figure in white robes kneels to light incense you once lit. The motions still matter. The present still calms. And in that moment, bedtime explorer, you realize something comforting. No one survives history, but some become its heartbeat. The world has fallen to a hush. The ceremonies are done. The lacquered doors are closed. Even the cherry trees, once bursting with gentle defiance each spring, now sleep in moonlit stillness. All that remains is breath. Yours. Theirs. His. You. And as you lie there, floating in the dark velvet space between centuries, you sense it, not the end, but the looping. The slow spiral of legacy curling back to where it began. You think back to the boy you once were, perched unsteadily on the edge of a throne handed to you not with triumph, but with trembling necessity. You never sought power. You never stormed into chambers declaring new decrees or reshaping worlds with words. Instead, you took your seat like someone settling into water that might be too hot, or too deep. You watched. You listened. You endured. And somehow, that was enough. History tends to prefer the loud ones, the sword wielders, the mad reformers. But then there's you, Emperor Go-Saga. The almost invisible architect of continuity. Historians still argue whether your reign was successful in the traditional sense. They bicker over how much influence you really had, or whether you were just another court-born noble swept along by larger tides. But they forget that influence isn't always a hammer. Sometimes it's a feather laid on just the right beam to keep the whole house from shifting. And so, long after your name stopped echoing in the political halls, it lingered in poems, rituals, and in the invisible etiquette of imperial behavior. You weren't the storm. You were the tuning silence afterward. Fringe detail. There are still monks today who copy out old imperial documents by hand. Ink on rice paper. Stroke by stroke. Occasionally, your signature appears at the bottom. When it does, the senior scribe always pauses, presses the brush to his forehead, and whispers a name not many remember. But they remember you. Because sometimes, bedtime isn't for tales of swords and fire, but of stillness that changed everything. Of a man who ruled by yielding. Who walked through history barefoot and left footprints only the patient can find. You're one of those footprints now. The Reiwa Emperor still bows in the same direction you once did. The lanterns are still lit in the same corridors. And somewhere, probably just before dawn, someone hums a lullaby to a child and calls it an old imperial tune, though no one quite remembers who composed it. Maybe it was you. Or maybe you simply made sure the music would last. So now, Bedtime explorer, let the story fade. Let the palaces collapse gently into mist, the robes soften into cloud, the ink of ancient scrolls run just a little with age. There's no need to chase facts anymore. No need to remember every name, or count each reign. You've walked through 13 centuries and not once did the ground shift beneath you. Feel the hush of Kyoto's midnight wind, slipping through paper walls. Hear the faint click of Jita's sandals across distant tiles. Smell the pine resin and faint trace of sandalwood, scents unchanged, unhurried, unwilling to vanish. This is where history rests. Where the emperors fold into the stars, and stories nestle in the folds of their sleeves like sleeping sparrows. There is peace in silence. There is legacy in slowness. You're drifting now, aren't you? Good. Drift like a caught fan in summer, half open, half asleep. Drift like Go-Saga himself, neither celebrated nor forgotten, but somewhere in between. An emperor of the in-between. The pause in the poem. The breath between bells. And as you exhale one last time tonight, know this, not all who change the world do so with noise. Some do it with stillness. So go gently now. Close your eyes. Feel the 1,000-year hush settle softly over your shoulders. And let the empire of dreams take you, quietly, into its fold,